I think it's a good segue to flip into this Jets matchup, this Monday night matchup here. Big one. Had a great time talking to Connor Rogers here this Wednesday night. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that, go back, YouTube, podcast, whatever. Connor, one of my absolute favorite guests to have on every year. Super smart dude. Really knows his stuff. This matchup's going to be tough. I think we all had pretty close one-score games going into this. But Bruce, you talked about that physicality that was missing from Travis Kelce. Well, the Bills have two of that at tight end right now in terms of, obviously Dawson Knox has a long track record of being able to make plays. He's been most consistently the biggest yards after catch player for the Bills over the last few years. It does it in a physical manner. And then you add in Kincaid, who maybe not as like stiff army and strong, but does provide physicality in a bigger receiver that is going to turn and go upfield in that way Kelce does and get the extra 5-10 yards and force DBs to tackle a bigger player. Is that going to be something that really is important in this type of matchup against the Jets, creating some of that physicality in the passing game?
I think so. I think that if you look back at the way that the Jets have historically played Josh Allen, I mean, you can make an argument that there's no team in the league that has played Josh Allen better than the New York Jets over the last couple of years. And I think that when you are focusing on winning your division first and foremost, and you look in the teams in your division and you go, okay, how can we get better against these defenses? I think a piece like Kincaid matters because that changes the flow. It changes the rhythm. I made a comment on Twitter that, last night, one of the two teams, both of them have good offensive lines. One of them clearly has an advantage at quarterback, but one of them had a short to intermediate middle of field piece that they can funnel a passing offense through in Amon-Ra St. Brown. The other team didn't have that, and that was Travis Kelce missing. And so I think that the Buffalo Bills have that piece now that can allow them to control the middle of the field in Dalton Kincaid. I think that being able to have him on the field and also be able to run out of 12, I think Damian Harris can help you establish some of that physicality. I think you have two of your three running backs who I would expect to actually get carries this year, barring injury. I think are both players that can help you establish that physicality. I think Latavius Murray was shockingly good last year and seems to still have it in the tank at 33 years old. And so I think that the addition of Dalton Kincaid then trickles into the control of the middle of the field in the yak, which then trickles into 12, which then trickles into run game. And all this stuff can compound to help you add a little bit of physicality every time, every dimension, every iteration I just mentioned adds just a little bit of physicality. And when you look back at the game, you go, wow, that really added up to a meaningful amount. And so for me, I think it all starts with Kincaid and the trickle effects of having him on the roster.
Yeah, and then you also add in Trent Sherfield, who sort of flew under the radar for the preseason, even though every important person talked him up incredibly, and we all saw highlights, and Josh Allen couldn't stop talking about him whenever it was brought up. And when you're talking about that type of physicality, I think you can still even not be 12 personnel, and you get that added physicality from him, paired with a Gabe Davis, who is also a really good blocker and a big physical wide receiver. And it gives you so many options. I know Anthony Prohaska loves to talk about rock, paper, scissors and being able to throw different options out there. The Bills have put Ken Dorsey in a really good position in terms of the tools in the tool chest. And at the end of the season last year, one of the biggest gripes Greg and I went through and talked about was we had some weapons, right? Like Gabe Davis is probably better than the production looked. And I think that was a direct correlation to Ken Dorsey. I think Dawson Knox, the same thing, a better, more productive player than his season appeared. I think it was because of Ken Dorsey. Well, now they've given you a plethora, right? It's almost to the point of embarrassment of treasures in terms of depth, I believe, in the NFL at these positions and the types of weapons you've gotten. How much pressure are we talking about is on Ken Dorsey now to just get this done, and not just the crazy analytics, but being able to really counterpunch and outmatch the opponent's defensive coordinator, and not just rely on Josh Allen to be Josh Allen.
I think it's a scenario where if you just view present state versus past state, okay, so you're in 11 personnel, and those receivers, you're in 2022, and your receivers are Diggs, Davis, McKenzie. Now take out McKenzie and put in Trent Sherfield. you could not possibly have a more different profile when it comes to plays at your disposal and the effectiveness of those plays when you go to McKenzie or Sherfield. Let's not even deal with the fact that this is not me bashing Isaiah McKenzie saying Sherfield is very, very much better. He's very, very much different. That's what I'm talking about. And so that stuff adds a different dynamic. If you want to have a player like that, you can still have Deontay Hardy in there, who I think is a more accomplished receiver than Isaiah McKenzie anyway. But if you want to have 11 heavy, you can do that. If you want to have 11 light, you can do that too. If you want to have 11 and a half, the way that Brandon Beane called it with Dalton Kincaid, you can do that too. So if you, like you mentioned with Dorsey, you have the options, and traits give you options. So you have a litany of traits at your disposal as an offensive coordinator. It's your responsibility to put them responsibly in a pot and be able to come up with the appropriate amount of, food and stew that you want to do. Anything I have a chance to do a stew metaphor, I'm going to do it. But you have all the ingredients in front of you. It's your job to mix and match them because you have them. Before you had Isaiah McKenzie as that option, you had Jamison Crowder as that option. That was your slot receiver option. You didn't have a second tight end who could provide you that. You didn't have a bigger slot receiver who could provide you that, which means if you went 11, you were lighter, and you were always in 11 because your best players happened to be that. But you didn't have any mix and match skill sets. So now you have the mix and match skill set. If you want to have a bigger slot, a more physical blocking slot, you can do that. If you want to put a tight end in there, you can do that. So you have the options at your disposal. Now, are you going to make good use of them? That's obviously yet to be seen. But I think it, as you mentioned, it almost takes a little bit of the excuses out. If you have an excuse for Ken Dorsey and anything you saw there, you go, you have the groceries. It's time for you to make the meal.
And I think even without Dawson Knox super involved in the preseason games, what we saw from Ken Dorsey, I think, is encouraging in the preseason, right? We saw a lot of 12. We saw tons of James Cook when we were talking about the starters. So those things seem encouraging that he saw the offseason, saw the same problems we did and wants to address them. This one, I'll throw it to anyone that's on the panel here. I did a poll, I forget, 2 days ago or something, talking about, now that we've settled some positions, right when Osiris Torrance got labeled a starter, Christian Benford, Terrell Bernard, and kind of put out, all right, now that we've been through this long and exhausting arguing offseason and we finally got a roster and we got a game to talk about, now we've been through it all, we've added the pieces, what's our biggest concerns? Because I know mine was protect Josh Allen right after that Bengals game. It was number one. I pinned it to my tweets. I was pounding the table for it. They did some stuff on the offensive line, but I took this poll and I put, middle linebacker, Spencer Brown at right tackle. I think the other one was cornerback too, and then other, and it wasn't even close. Spencer Brown at right tackle was by far everybody's biggest concern heading into the season. I think offensive line you can just chalk up as a whole. I think even though we're happy with some of the interior spots, there's still some concern to be had there. Did the Bills do enough to protect Josh Allen heading into this year to where you guys feel comfortable? Chris, if you're speaking, I can't hear you.
So I think so, but not in the sense of, they brought in Jermaine Ifedi, which is fine, whatever, I think that, provides some support to, Spencer Brown. I think what they did, which kind of lends itself to what Bruce was saying, they gave Josh a lot of quick hit options, a lot of pressure release valves, a lot of receivers or Dalton Kincaid, so that if the pocket collapses, which was something that he couldn't do last year, he can get the ball out quick enough. You saw last year, Josh's release time went from, I think it was 2.7 to 3.4. And those 0.7 seconds mean everything, especially in the Bills offense. So I think having guys that Josh can get the ball out in time, I think Brandon Beane, though he did kind of double down on Spencer Brown and, unfortunately he has to live with it at this point. I think he kind of gave himself a bit of an out by also providing options like Deontay Hardy, Trent Sherfield, Dalton Kincaid, James Cook, all these options that he can release the ball to quickly if necessary.
Yeah, I definitely think that is a way to release pressure. Also, again, James Cook involved in the passing game, right? Like using your running backs to fight off pressure. Usually if they're bringing extra guys, those guys that leak out are going to find space and going to be open. It's just, it's a lot easier to do things in the traditional way and give your quarterback clean pockets. We see the data, even though Josh is really good under pressure. Quarterbacks tend to be better when they can throw from a clean pocket. So it would be ideal if we could get that figured out. I do think the addition of Dalton Kincaid allowing Knox, I don't think he'll exclusively be stuck to Spencer Brown's hip and be blocking all the time, but even just those chips before he goes out. Eric posted a great video from one of the preseason games where he just laid a defensive end out. Like he really is a good physical presence that can help with some of that. So I think there's a little bit of addition there from Dalton Kincaid as well that gives a little flexibility to what Dawson Knox can do in terms of protection. So there's some pieces that you can patch together, but I'm not as concerned about Deion Dawkins as I am obviously about Spencer Brown, because we've seen Deion play at such a great level and do it against some of the best talent in the league. But he didn't have a great preseason here either. And while I feel good about O'Cyrus Torrence, and especially compared to what has been at the guard position the last few years for the Buffalo Bills, I think interior offensive line has been one of Beane's most mishandled assets and positions, especially at the discredit to Mitch Morse, who's a great center, has had to play with below average players next to him his whole time here in Buffalo. I think they've raised the floor there, but we haven't seen O'Cyrus Torrence be able to really handle defensive coordinators' game planning against the right side, which I think is the weakness of this Bills offense, just from an experience standpoint. There's things he hasn't seen and he's going to have to get used to. And there's things that Spencer Brown really struggled with still last year. And so those two are going to have to communicate. So you have your least experienced and biggest, weakest link on that side of the field. To me, I think they can do okay. I think they'll have some good games, but at some point these are going to present problems, and good defensive coordinators are going to take advantage of some of that stuff.
Many people ask us the best way to support us here at Cover One, and that is to sign up to become a Cover One Pass member. That contribution helps give us the access to all the data and information we use to create the content that you love.
And I think most importantly, brings you into our community of insiders. It's a great community based on Slack. I know a lot of people don't want to be on social media anymore or be in on those conversations. We bring all of it to you right in our great community of educated fans. And most importantly, you get access to our content creators.
Even better than that, everybody loves merch. You get awesome t-shirts, a cool decal, and a letter from the Cover One team signed directly to you.
All for $60. That gets you the entire season, next year's free agency and draft. $60. Click the link in the description. Cover One Insider. Become one today. Here, Joe. You're back. What's up?
Hey, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Gotcha.
All right, beautiful. Sorry about that. I'm trying to find a good spot at this new place. But to answer that question, I do think they did. Right tackle, like you, Aaron, was one of my bigger concerns. It still is to a point. But where I think they've overall improved, and kind of branching off what Thomas said, is the personnel they've added in the offseason on the interior part of the offensive line, as well as their running backs, which I think is a huge point of emphasis for what this offense will eventually look like, are why I'm more confident that they've tried to protect Josh Allen. Because when you're lining up at a 12P, you're essentially enhancing the physicality of this team to the point where I feel like it's going to put less pressure on Allen to hold the ball, because these vertical routes that you will still see during the year aren't going to be what they lean on all the time. I think you have weapons that in the backfield, Allen's going to be able to just hand the ball off to if he sees something where there's an opportunity to get yards. But also, again, with your middle of the field options that you've all been talking about, Sherfield, Kincaid, Knox, obviously, and then you have to talk about Hardy, too. I've said it a bunch of times, but I think yards after catch is what they're really trying to establish in the passing game, where they're not going to ask Allen to be superhero all the time, but rather get the ball at a short or intermediate distance and let these guys get those extra yards, so that when you go into situations where, it's second, third down, rather than consistent stretches of 10, 8, 7 yards, it's much more attainable, where you actually have opportunity to be an aggressive offense without the cost of it being the end of your drive. So I think in that regard, there is a lot more protection for Allen. But where I worry, especially against the Jets team that seems to play to Allen's tendencies, which is him being aggressive, him trying to air it downfield, is Josh Allen going to protect himself? Because even though Allen's pocket presence is a great asset and he is able to roll out and escape things, he can get himself into trouble. And that's problematic when you're talking about an offense that seems to predicate itself, at least from what I've seen and what I've been anticipating, on being more patient, being more methodical, being able to just, hey, this is what the defense is doing. It's a too high shell. There's something opening up. Just take that guy, let him go, move on to the next play. I think a part of it is you don't want Allen to not be Superman, but Allen's got to know when he could just calm down. When there's an opportunity to do it, take it, but don't force it, because at that point, I think that's when you're going to get yourself into trouble.
I don't think Josh Allen will ever stop doing some of those things, right? Like, I agree, you want to always get it down a little bit. But when Thomas was talking about that, of getting the ball out quick, I agree. And I think, especially this week against the Jets, that's got to be, after watching what that defensive line did last year to you want to see lots of RPO, lots of just getting the ball out of his hands fast and keeping those guys off of him. But he does have the tendency to want to extend plays. But the magic comes there too. So I've always been torn and conflicted on, how much of that do we want to put a governor on Josh Allen, and like at what point do you want to cap that? I don't have the right answers for that because he makes so many great special things happen. But also, to the point of yards after catch that you brought up, I'd love to talk everybody here. I love all your football opinions and find you guys smart. Sometimes this show turns from, hey, let's talk about this Bills specific matchup, into a little bit of football philosophy, right? And you're talking about yards after catch and scheming that up, and I think there's some of that involved. But yards after catch to me has been a really frustrating conversation over the last couple of years. Like during the draft process, we hear about yak guys adding it to a team, and obviously the Bills, it's been a topic of discussion of trying to find more for Josh, and there's a good chance Josh just isn't that kind of quarterback, right? Like it is extend plays, it's get guys open, it's hitch routes, which you're not going to get a lot of yards after catch on, and dig routes and stuff like that. And maybe the players just aren't those types of guys, but there's so much other stuff that goes into it, right? How defense is scheming. If you have a run game and you're bringing players up in the box, like all those things impact ability for yards after catch. And I think it just gets so diluted into like, hey, we just have to find more of it. And sometimes it's not that easy to just get a yak player. Like the Tyreek Hills of the world are kind of rare, right? There's not a lot of those guys that just outmatch any scheme or whatever it is you do. So what are your guys' belief on yak? Can you just get a fast twitchy guy and start collecting yak, or is it something that it's taking what the defense gives you, it's scheming yak open, or is it a mixture of all these things?
I think it's three things. I think it's ball placement and timing, I think it's route combinations and concepts, and I think it's physical ability of the receiver. And those three things all work together. If you're creating a yak plurality pie, that's what it would be. And so we have a tendency to only really focus on one of the three based on what part of the offseason that we're in, right? If we're in the player acquisition part of the offseason, then we focused on the physical ability of the receiver. I think if we're in different parts of the season, then we might focus on different concepts. If it's a quarterback we don't like, I think we're more willing to focus on ball placement. And so I think that all three of those things go together. And the fact that all three of them is housed in three different locations, one of the responsibilities is housed with the quarterback, one of the responsibilities housed with the offensive play caller and designer, and the other part of the responsibility is housed with the receiver. I think that the fact that they're housed so differently means it's almost impossible to isolate them. And so you have to, why aren't you getting more yak is an extremely complicated answer, because it's an extremely complicated question.
Yep.
And we have to be able to look at all three of those. And part of it is going to be something we're not confident with, which is, part of it we have to talk about the offensive system, as you mentioned, with hitches and comeback routes and hooks and things like that. These are not yak confident routes.
Yeah.
Like
a lack of a screen game.
Right.
During our time at Buffalo, that adds a lot to yak for teams like Kansas City. Another thing, can I maybe try to convince you to add one more little sliver to that plurality pie? And
Sure.
It's not a controllable that you would have in-house, but I look at how the Bills defense has played for years. And this is something I know offline. You and I have had this conversation of adequate cornerback play, and not every reception's a bad reception depending on scheme and what people are doing. And the Bills have done a really good job at controlling yak, right? And limiting some of that big explosive plays, obviously not against Tyreek Hill, but for the most part, their data shows that's a team that scheme limits some of that yak. So defensive scheme and how teams play you, whether it's stacking boxes, playing a lot of too high shell stuff, keeping things in front of them, that impacts yak as well, no matter what you're doing on your end.
Yeah, there's a correlation between yak allowed and man coverage percentages. That correlation exists. If the teams that have a tendency to run higher percentages of man coverage have a tendency to also give up more yak. I think that there's also a correlation between blitz percentage and yak because there's fewer defenders on one side of the player versus on the other side of the player when the ball is caught. So yes, like you mentioned, it's not a controllable from an offensive system standpoint, but both of those things do matter.
Yeah. And you can control some. I think this is the one thing, too, that I see a lot of fans get frustrated about when, for years, say it's a 2nd and 8, a 2nd and long, and Josh Allen checks to a run, and everyone's pissed at Brian Daboll for calling runs on 2nd and 2, but he's getting the looks that he's seeing. And so there's that little bit of chess match, too, where coordinators can try to get a defense into certain looks to allow for more stuff, right? So like even if a team wants to play you too high, let them play too high. And if you can get that run game going, they're going to get at it too high at some point. And then you can, scheme in the yak and stuff like that. So there's some level of controllability, but you really got to become the dictator on the offensive side of the ball.
Right. The Kansas City Chiefs are famous for they throw into man coverage more than any team in the league. And people are like, why are you playing so much man coverage against the Chiefs? No, you don't understand. They're choosing to throw into man coverage. They want anytime they make a maneuver. Andy Reid gives a pre-snap check to Patrick Mahomes, and he knows it's man. He's going to try to throw the ball. He wants to. So part of that is dictated by you, but also part of it is dictated by the fact that you're just willing to at least call it. Like you mentioned, if there's too high against a run, go ahead and run it, right? If you see one high, you want to try and throw against that. And so that's just the way that works. So like you said, there's so many factors that go into yak. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't work at addressing them one at a time. It just means diagnosing, quote unquote, the issue is just, it's an exercise in futility. There is no the issue. It's some sort of factor of all of these. We just added 2 more things, so 5 or 6 of these factors. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go out and try and get yak players. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to get a better screen game going to increase something, because yak is good, right? But it just means that identifying, quote unquote, the issue is just almost foolhardy without tremendous amount of data and hundreds of hours of research.
Yep. Yeah, no, I agree. And all right, we'll bring it back a little bit on track unless anyone else has anything to add to the philosophy of yak here in the canons of football. If we don't have anything to add to that, let's kind of return focus to this Jets matchup. We talked a lot about this Bills offense and some of our concerns there. Obviously, huge concern on the defense in the middle of the field. Huge shoes to fill from Tremaine Edmunds leaving. Regardless of how you felt about him, I think as a Bills fan, we know the responsibilities given to him because of the traits and athleticism that he presented is stuff that a lot of guys just can't do. And so these are large shoes to fill from what we're used to, how the scheme runs. And so Sean McDermott taking over this defense already was going to make changes, but he's going to have to now be forced to make some changes in how we see this linebacker unit cover in some of the coverages. We know there's still going to be a zone heavy team. How confident is everybody feeling in this defense? Obviously there's good players at every level, and you think that, hey, if there's a one weak link, maybe we can patch that up. But Terrell Dotson, we knew from the preseason that wasn't going to work. We didn't get a chance to really see Terrell Bernard in live action to sort of build up that confidence that, yes, the athleticism that we saw in college and somewhat in the preseason last year can be something that translates not to Tremaine Edmunds' level, but can maybe be not a huge drop off, at least athletically in coverage, and presents us, some of that Milano blitz ability. Like, where are you guys here in the middle of this defense going into a big game against a veteran quarterback?
I think there's, unfortunately, with Bills fans right now, I think a lot of what's going on is we're basing our opinions off of a guy that most linebackers are just not physically built like, right? I mean, we know Tremaine Edmunds being 6'5", guy could run sub 4.6. He had a wingspan that's, ridiculous, over 70 inches. It's hard to compare, right? People are just going to innately look at Terrell Bernard and say, well, he isn't this, he isn't this. Well, the one thing he is he is very good in man coverage over the middle. He was a coverage linebacker coming out of Baylor. So in regards to that, there's things that he's going to be able to do that's very different. The other thing is, one of the big gripes about Tremaine Edmonds was that he was not good against the run. Well, one of the things Terrell Bernard is good against is blitzing and against the run. So I think there's going to be some positives. There's going to be some negatives. Obviously, there's going to be some learning curves there. But the one thing that'll benefit him is he has a solid secondary behind him and an even better defensive line this year than there was last year. Having a guy like Leonard Floyd who can help Greg Rousseau and clamp down on that C gap, having a guy like Poona Ford, a guy like Daquan Jones, Ed Oliver, all those guys are going to help Terrell Bernard and his learning curve. So that as he's kind of growing into that position, I think it's going to be an easier transition than I think that people are expecting. Now, I think the tough part is we haven't seen him yet. We've only seen him play one game as the will linebacker. So it's innately a little fearful, but I think people need to have an open mind that his traits coming out of college could very translate to what they want him to do.
What do you guys think are his realistic odds of remaining the starter into October? So like maybe mid-October, a month into the football season. Do you think Terrell Bernard will still be starting, or is Christian Kirksey going to get activated here and become the starter?
I would hedge my bets on Bernard still being the starter for the reason that while Kirksey's a veteran, I do think that Kirksey is really the option to turn to should Bernard need plays off or if he has to go down instead of Tyrel Dodson. So I had said going into camp that I thought Dodson was probably going to be your vet option. He might even be the starter until he's unseated. He seems to have unseated himself with really bad preseason performances. And while he's still on the roster, I'm firmly convinced that they went out and got Christian Kirksey because they want to hedge their bets on Terrell Bernard being the starter and see what they have with him. But God forbid there's any reason that he has to come off the field. Your option instead of Dodson is now a vet linebacker who's played, plenty of football and had a lot of tackles last year that you could turn to and feel a little bit better about than someone who has just given you no reason to feel good about that position.
I'm a little torn because I feel like they explored the linebacker position a little bit in free agency and were not really able to do anything. And that market, Joe Marino had a whole episode talking about, this summer when we were kind of like, man, what are they going to do at linebacker? The job is not figuring itself out. We don't have confidence. He looked at free agency and they're really, the way he broke it down, I agreed. There wasn't anyone that you could bring in that really lifted that floor. And then you had to wait till the point of guys getting cut. And Kirksey's been on that watch list for a while. Eric Turner has had him on there for probably like 3 years or so. Every time he's a free agent, he's been on that watch list. I think he's been on the pro players watch list, obviously connected with guys like Micah Hyde. Players were calling out for him. So I do, part of me thinks that they have been wanting to upgrade here in terms of experience. And, Kirksey, maybe he's lost a step in terms of athleticism, but you can gain a step when you're a veteran in terms of processing, right? And there are going to be instances, no matter how good Terrell Bernard plays here to start his career, there's going to be moments where a really good offensive coordinator challenges that processing and shows him stuff he hasn't seen before. And he's going to be a step behind and he's going to make the wrong decision when it's an option to come up and play the quarterback or stay with a tight end. Some of those things are going to happen. And so I think Sean McDermott, the coaching staff, more times than not, coaches lean towards trusting players that can play within the scheme. And we've seen Sean McDermott almost do it to a detriment. And so part of me thinks that there's a plan to the timing just didn't work out where they feel confident in him coming in week one, but that Kirksey's almost just sitting there drooling, waiting to get in. Am I way off on that?
I don't think way off. This is my thing too. I do believe that there's going to be, like you said, growing pains for Bernard. There just has to be, right? Like his first true time starting in that role. And you're going to want to allow a veteran to come in and kind of clean up the mess if Bernard's struggling for any reason. But on the flip side of that, because I think if he plays well and well enough to show you that he has the starting spot, I still want Kirksey to be on the active roster because it's just nice to have a veteran there. But I do think, if he's playing well enough, then why would you kind of remove the opportunity for him to start? And I mean, well enough where you actually feel confident when he's on the field, Like, growing pains are going to happen at that position because even with a good processor, even if the defensive line is having a bad game for whatever reason, he might get exploited. That happened.
Yeah.
That happened to Edmonds a lot. So
The best case scenario is the draft pick works out, you get the controlled cost of a rookie deal, and you're banking on the athleticism having a higher ceiling, right? Like that clearly will be the best case scenario for the Bills, is that he's playing well. And that's what I think we're all rooting for. Thanks to everybody here on the panel that came on to join me for the first one. I hope I get to talk to you guys all year long here. So, all right, fellas. Well, I appreciate everybody. Thanks again for coming out. Go Bills.